the ideas implicit within embodied cognition and its predecessors in things like cognitive semantics, you sort of arrive from the idea that the mechanisms of thought parallel the mechanisms of the body. And here I'm talking specifically about the mechanisms of abstract thought. And I think Steven Pinker says something about this. He says something to the effect that the cognitive structures which evolved in order to allow us to function in the physical world respond to forces and sensory engagements of different sorts. Those mechanisms, Pinker says, are being kind of copied across to another part of our cognitive apparatus, where the syntax stays the same, but the vocabulary is allowed to change. Different entities have been dropped into those slots that would be occupied by the objects and forces and relationships that one finds in real-world experience, in a metaphorical sense, so that when we talk about a category being like a container, those elements of a container that form part of the mechanics or the syntax of lived experience, the inside, outside, the idea of there being an opening of some sort, and the various logics that follow from that, all that syntactical or mechanical relationship stays the same when it's copied across to the area of the mind that can use it as a metaphor. But those actual physical things are replaced by metaphorical insides and outsides, metaphorical openings, and a kind of metaphorical logic which follows from that, so that so we could start to see categories as containers, for example. That wasn't what I wanted to talk about. Where am I going with this? I have to retrace my steps to try and remember what I was going to say when I turned the camera and I can't remember. Mark Johnson, I was going to talk about. Cognitive linguistics. God, it's completely gone. I'll walk back a couple of steps and see if that reminds me. It wasn't to do with memory. Oh, I remember now, yeah. It's, I've just been wondering why, in that case, if there's that one-to-one mapping, sort of, between the experiences in the real world and the experiences in cognition, so the structures of cognition match the structures of the real world. Why is it that cognition does things that the real world doesn't? Why is it that when I'm using metaphors in sentences, they don't hang around, they disappear, or they shift into something else, or that metaphors mix, or they can, all the, it seems like some of the physics of the real world have been copied across, if you like, but then some other stuff either hasn't, or different sorts of physics have been copied across. I think I've mentioned this before. When I talk about a family tree, for example, clearly I'm using a tree metaphor, or in Pinker's terms, I've copied across the physical experience of some attributes of a tree into another part of my mind, where I can take out things like branches and bark and stems and trunks and roots and slap in different members of my family, so I can visualize that as a tree structure. But why is it, in this sense, that I can talk about my family tree, but at a certain point I can just drop it and start talking about my family as if it was some kind of river, a river out of Eden, as Dawkins describes the entire history of evolution. Or I can talk about my family as being a series of stories in a book almost. So there seems to be no requirement within that copying across mechanism that there be some big consistency in those metaphors, which suggests that either there's something highly contingent about those processes, highly partial, and I guess pragmatic about those processes, so that there would be only those consistencies in the metaphor are copied across, which are absolutely necessary. Another possible option is that, given that the sort of common sense physics of trees and rocks and literal embodied experience is only a tiny portion of what's actually going on in the world. Most of the things that are happening around us are queerer than we can suppose, as Haldane puts it. Anything smaller than an ant or larger than a mountain is pretty much, the physics of it is pretty much counterintuitive. That suggests that there's all sorts of things happening around us which don't make a lot of sense, or wouldn't make a lot of sense if we placed our attention on them. And maybe part of it sort of recognises that. I mean, certainly all of other living creatures tend to be highly unpredictable, and their behaviour shape-shifts constantly, and they tend to appear and disappear in the form of being born and dying. So there is at least a sort of burgeoning knowledge somewhere in our minds that the quasi-Newtonian world that we occupy, this sort of mechanical, naively, intuitively physical world, doesn't completely describe our experience. There are huge gaps which we sort of know about. So maybe it's a recognition of that that's shifting across. Maybe the slightly odd syntactical elements of thought which don't reproduce the syntax of physical experience, if you like. Those disappearances and those changes. Maybe they do reflect some parts of our experience, but not those parts of experience which we can put a name to and intuitively grasp. I'm reminded here, and this is highly unlikely relevance, but I'm reminded here about, is it Wolfgang Pauli? I think it was Wolfgang Pauli, who exchanged a whole series of communications, letters with Jung, the psychoanalyst. And he had this idea, which he called background physics, I think. And he had this idea that that somehow in our subconscious, in the Jungian subconscious, the Jungian unconscious, which is the stuff of archetypes and dreams and strangeness, I suppose. He Pauli reckoned that in there was some of the principles of non-Newtonian physics, of quantum physics and of relativity. He was probably mad, though, Wolfgang Pauli, in many ways. Very, very interesting, but probably mad.